He crawls so tall. The man's words bounced off the walls of my skull as I shivered its shapes in my peripheral vision. I could already feel my feet tingling, could already feel something starting to drag its prickly transparent form across the top of my toes, a small crawl that would grow. It was too late whether I had wanted to welcome the tall crawl or not. He was there. Follow the rules, Kai. One which had burrowed deeply like the tarmac, snaking through grooves in fields and mounds, a long country road that ascended toward a secluded psychiatric hospital. The ward was a gray blot atop a hilly landscape, one with 3 stories of tall glass panes lined up far too squarely. I jolted in fear and looked down to find that reality was no better than the mirror's illusion. It's a horrible case. Are you okay? I swallowed my fear. Something I'd rather not repeat. I shouldn't have come here. Since I had first glimpsed the hospital on the horizon, a prison which barely held this imposing man, I had felt something that I didn't know how to explain. The building pained my eyes for a reason that I didn't know, yet trusted with unwavering certainty. Roberts to do anything awful to her too. What have I done? I cried. Because I broke the 3rd rule, Cedric whispered, displaying the first sign of anything vaguely resembling fright. I stumbled into the shade of a backwards tree. I heard about your date too. As a young, steel-balled investigative journalist, I had faced war criminals, traffickers, and next-door killers. As a young, steel-balled investigative journalist, I felt invincible, and that sort of adrenaline blinds a person to danger. I had hoped that the 11 cuts were figments of my imagination, but as I drove out of the car park looking up at the windows of the hospital, it became clear that I hadn't imagined anything. The months since that day have been torturous. Rules whispered to Cedric in his head. The urge began. My name is Kai Martin, but I went by a catchier moniker on YouTube. Sure, that monster who killed his family. I reminded myself once more as I unlocked the front door, but bed would wait. 3. There is no tall crawl. Fingernail Princess had been left by Cedric, but something of significance. Awful words were etched into my flesh. Heart drilling at a brutal beat, I didn't hesitate. There was no escaping it. I had to face my fate and be done with it. I shot up and looked out of my front yard. Of course, there was no one to be seen. He looks like so many things. My eyes started to water as I spotted something not out of place, for it had never been placed there at all. Andreas and I are not gardeners. Our front yard has always been empty. I nodded, wrestling with the force that bound me tighter than any belt, and then mouthed, "What does he look like? This personification of your illness." I don't have obsessive-compulsive disorder, Kai. They had slithered through my screaming lips. I thought that would be my end, but there is no end. For its servants, only greater depths of horror. Cedric was an ordinary man, an outwardly dull fellow whose profession I don't remember. I wasn't cured. There followed a sense of freedom, but it drowned in all-consuming terror. Rosetta Wright's death was linked to Cedric Roberts in some way. What do you mean? I mouthed, choking on fear of perhaps slug-like entities wedged in my throat. Are there more rules? Cedric Roberts held a finger up to his lips and loudly shushed, but I gasped in bewilderment. Yeah, I know. Given his volatile nature, however, Dr. Yu and Andreas are going to get me in trouble. My local newspaper was an endangered medium, eyeballed by greasy bundles of cod and chips more than humans. Let's put it that way. What is a backwards tree? I inwardly asked, lips moving silently in the mirror on the wall. As the fleshy bark danced with slight movements, much like the cables, I knew that it was the tall crawl. Unless I should have turned off every single light on the planet. Those were the 5 rules of life by which Cedric Roberts lived. So have I, she started, sounding unconvinced. I won't, I whispered, understanding what it meant. I had to do that one little thing or Isabel wouldn't have made it. Time to figure out what had happened to me. I had a feeling that you might have blinked. Relax, I said. I didn't tell him what I saw, didn't tell him what I felt, but the doctor followed me, cornering me into a conversation, and he noticed the wounds on my left forearm. He chastised me for trying to conceal them, chastised me for not seeking help. In late June, my brother dumped a dollop of waste onto my lap. 1. Do whatever he bids and do it twice if you doubt yourself. Bloody crescent-shaped dents had been trodden into my left arm, as if I were Cedric's reflection. The wounds were in the exact spots the man's walking fingers had marked in his own skin. Maybe your own reflection lingering in the mirror after you've walked away. As if in dreaded response, something changed in my reflection. I was struggling to wrestle with that notion any longer, and then I became consumed by one of my oldest fears, the possibility that I might have inherited my late mother's disorder. His arms were still tightly bound in the restraining belt. She sought justice in all areas of life, and I didn't want her to fight my battle. Behind the window of 307 there stood Cedric Roberts waving at me, and hidden behind him a silhouetted figure waved its far longer arm in unison with the patient like some perverse puppet master, an arm without color, without texture, without substance. When I looked down to see only one hand holding on to the steering wheel, I realized that my free one was waving back at Cedric Roberts. You might have seen my channel back in the day, but I'm not going to provide a link. Anyway, by December of 2021, it was profitable enough for me to quit the day job. Am glad I didn't see, though I doubt it had a form to be seen. 10 fingers slithered across my face, beelining towards an open, screeching mouth. Knock, knock. Anyway, he ended up in a psychiatric unit, my brother said. Moreover, freelance journalism comes without restrictions. I had bought into Cedric's tall tale of a tall crawl. The temporary relief was perforated by a pang of realization too. He looks like so many things, Cedric had said. I frantically messaged 3Y, searched my memory vault. Searched for some memory of Cedric lunging forwards, perhaps incline away at my skin, but he hadn't. As if I had finally tossed aside the hospital-grade belt, restraining my thoughts. A sunken pit sat in the middle of my featureless reflection, caving inwards from all sides and forming an impossibly black hole at the center of my face, one which had passed beyond the back of my skull, and it did not reveal the wall on the other side. What does that even mean? When I made it to the blackened lobby of my house, not daring to flick a single switch, I noticed something. You should keep them safe. Please let me leave, I begged in my head. Only air escaped my mouth as I contented with the horror of being unable to speak. My mirrored face didn't look back at me with a smile. How had one of his arms freed itself for a moment? Nothing in that place made sense, but the 11 curved cuts on my forearm told me that, at the very least, it had been no figment of my imagination. Just a heads up before we get into today's video. Fresh scars formed alongside the bloody dents inflicted by Cedric Roberts, and I was certain, in my peripheral vision, that the red standby light had moved, as if it were the eye of the crawl, watching me from the black. I had not defeated the tall crawl. The rest of the house was entirely dark. He was interesting in only one way. The man claimed to have been misdiagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder. I lied. He said that he would save my baby girl. The patient said, ignoring me again. The patient calmly insisted. I was scared, Kai, but the tall crawl blessed me with a bird to break. It fluttered on little legs through the door, smiling unknowingly and humming a pleasant tune. Andreas or Holly. My Isabel didn't mind. And then he placed a brick on the accelerator and let the car roll through the barrier into the oncoming train. Witnesses said that his wife and 2 daughters were banging on the windows and screaming. He told me that he didn't want to kill his entire family, that he had to kill them. I knew what this supposed family man had done, a heinous act driven by a mind either evil or unwell. I still wasn't sure which, and that was what I wanted to investigate. She had been broken by her obsessive-compulsive disorder. I smiled uneasily. Honestly, I just want to uncover the truth. Cedric whispered, giggling. I don't, I promised. 4. No artificial light between 1 and 6 in the morning, but as I dipped my fingers into the entanglement of cables, the flesh on my arms started to shiver, started to sprout tiny bumps. As if I had doused my flaming mind with cold water. No artificial light. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and OCD. Walk no fewer than 11 steps per hour. There are more than 5. With that foreign motivation imprinted upon me, I knew that I didn't have to do this, didn't have to suffer a punishment for not obeying meaningless rules, didn't have to obey the rules at all, in fact. It's weak, I thought. Who made you kill your family? He smiled. I needed to disprove it. I felt it again, the primitive urge to turn back. The same instinct that had detected something worse than eyes watching me from the hospital windows, and also inferred from the tone of David's voice that doctor it was starting. I was being consumed by the insidious intent that had cursed Cedric, that had forced him to kill his loved ones, and the very same murderous urge hauled me out of the front door in the early unlit hours of the morning. Only right, given what he does to keep me safe. Get to the point, I said, blushing. And that was it. It wasn't even a tree. Only when the footsteps of some unseen figure halted at the door to 307, but were not accompanied by knocking knuckles, did a meek groan finally escape my lips. Now that's a typical claim for sufferers of this illness. That foreboding feeling on the drive home had been a warning, a reminder that I was on the verge of breaking one of the crawl's laws. Ones that I wanted. He'd saved her, but there were always more bad things to stop, always more rules to follow. And then came the crunch of grass beneath shoes, signaling an approach. I will tell you about the things that followed, the things that I had to do, but not today. Some oddities are terrible, like the foetal shape of a body that rose beneath Cedric's duvet, a shape that the patient roughly flattened with the thump of his hand before massaging the bed slowly, uncomfortably. My heart throbbed sharply at the sight that I knew I hadn't imagined, and then the man transformed his 2 longest fingers into striding legs, before marching them slowly up his right arm. It wasn't simply the sound of rustling from downstairs that had woken me. It was an alarm bell ringing from a clotted compartment of my brain. Do whatever he bids and do it twice if you doubt yourself. A pinprick of redness spilling out from the black living room. The television standby by light. She said, he threatened one of my colleagues. I sighed with relief and waved gleefully at my friends as I stepped into the house. I'm such an idiot. It was sinisterly straightforward, actually. Sure, separated from the family killer by a wooden door and a plastered wall, I thought envisioning all of the ways in which the patient might butcher me before he would arrive, but I inhaled deeply, summoned every shred of my courage, and I entered the white-walled cell labeled 307. Cedric Roberts was constricted by a taut leather belt around his midsection, but nothing could have restrained his untoward grin. The man sat cross-legged on a neatly made duvet. As the man rapped his knuckles against an imaginary door, my brain matter squelched painfully. I had taken the rules seriously, making sure to inspect every room after our friends had gone home. Old and withered skin perhaps, but skin and the leaves, neither green nor any natural color, left me with a wretched feeling in my gut. Backwards, I don't know how to explain it, but the tree was undoubtedly backwards. There are no words that make sense of such a thing because it's an impossibility. Don't you think that I know that? A tree has no front, no back. It was, nonetheless, backwards, reversed somehow. But there it stood. A small ash tree in the grass. My brother woke up with a splutter which somehow did not wake Holly, and blood filled his gaping mouth. Walk no fewer than 11 steps per hour. I had just completed a ritual, unknowingly perhaps, but that didn't matter. I had done as instructed. That was why I felt better. Don't be silly, I thought while greeting each of my friends. Holly frowned. Are you really okay, Guy? You said that you've interviewed worse people than Cedric Roberts. And Izzy enjoyed 10 perfect years, which is better than none. It was evident, however, that the tall crawl existed. I tried in vain to free my hand and forearm from its snare, but the living cable seized me, cut into my flesh. Whether due to paralysis or choice, I do not know. I like that you've written them down, the patient eventually said, nodding at the set of rules inked on my quaking hand. Well, what did you discuss? She asked. I mouthed, trying to convince myself rather than him. I snapped the birdie. Bad things happened to your wife and daughters, I soundlessly uttered. May I have her details? I asked. In an upcoming post, I will tell you what happened next. We didn't discuss anything confidential. I nodded. I said, trying and failing to lighten the tone. Something that hides beneath fresh folds on your palms. Doctor, he looks like so many things, Kai. As I tore out a bad, ears throbbing, I was acutely aware of that sensation from the evening before, the warm tension that I had felt during the journey home, the fear that I had forgotten something. I checked all of the lights, I thought, heart pounding as I slipped downstairs. A coat hanging strangely on a hook. There was, however, no denying the scarring tissue on my left arm. Don't walk in the shade of a backwards tree. 2. The man taunted lowly, eyes twitching like things other than pupils. The cables continued moving. The dark worm-like clump surged and grew, forming a hunching body, one that seemed to verge on standing, but instead chose to squat in the darkness. Pendleton said. I'll have to ask for Cedric's permission, of course. No artificial light between 1 and 6 in the morning. I keep telling myself that I need the crawl to keep my loved ones safe, but I think my mind has twisted the truth. No. Don't walk in the shade of a backwards tree. That rule rang in my mind. She had been tortured for years, decades even. The silhouetted man shrank and sank into the carpet, resting against the wall in a fetal position. Don't walk in the shade of a backwards tree. And then, to my great surprise, the television's plug disconnected on its own accord. The red light faded as its shadowy eyelids shot, and I dragged my shivering body across the floor. You do now. Besides, it shouldn't have been possible for my brother to keep shoveling through that rock-bottom floor. Snap the bird when it sings. Well, because she's dead, he bluntly answered. A word was dashed and a new one was written above to form a new message. I was only having a weird day, that's all. My beautiful Isabel message 3 ed him tall crawl. I reported on whatever so pleased me. Began no, she said to herself, shaking her head and changing her mind. It wasn't her, the ground quaint swallowing the last of the thing, pretending to be an ash tree swallowing me before I had a chance to do a thing. Andreas is still alive, though barely formed, sank into the grass joining the tree in some treacherous underworld. I clung to him, hoping to save him, hoping to suffer with him at the very least. But the blades of grass closed, sealing him away. Holly and I dug for an hour trying to reach him in a blind, traumatized panic, but he was gone. Andreas nodded. That was the terrifying truth that I wanted to ignore. Just message 3 her, Holly, I said, rolling my eyes. Rosetta Wright would have been more helpful, Mr. Andreas whispered, shivering as he eyed the branches above us. Holly, help. The police officer started to stir, opening her eyes with a shake, and then she screamed at the sight of my brother, screamed at the tree which started to twist and spiral into the dirt. The night passed by in a blur, as did my thoughts, racing, unintelligible thoughts born of fever daydreams. As hot fear coursed through my blood, I thought of Mom. Holly's static voice poured through the car speakers. Snap the bird when it sings. Something watched me from one of the windows. The cluster of cables didn't pursue me. But he's a different breed, you know that. I darted into the living room, bludgeoning my shin on the sharp edge of the coffee table, and then I dropped to my knees and crawled towards the television stand. I had to kill the red glow. Besides, a tweeting bird just landed on my windowsill. Swimmers planted either by my fearful subconsciousness or the long spectral fingers that had fiddled with my brain. Rules that I had scribbled on my hand while doing research on his case. David Pendleton said after I entered the building and introduced myself. The atypical thing was that he claimed to serve something outside of them. An unseen pile hung over the boxy room. Up to your breast, up to your frown, up to the tippy-top of your crown, whispered his voice in my head. I didn't bother attempting to tell white lies in front of Holly's face. I know that there's a way out, but I don't see it, not yet. I whispered, lips twitching. A bell that amidst all the neural noise I had missed earlier. I knew that she had battled something different, yet not dissimilar. There are always more. Views are down this month. We really need to come up with an exciting video for next week. I knew she wasn't buying it. Holly knew, much like Andreas, that she had seen and felt something which had contradicted all reason. Mom was here, she whimpered, curling up into a tighter ball on the grass. It didn't reveal anything that the human gaze knew how to decipher. Sighed. I shot to my feet, falling for the illusion that the demon had given me back my freedom for a second. You look pale, Cedric whispered, drawing my gaze to him. That fact, alongside the oppressive sensation of 307's watchful wall shrinking, filled me with a foreign strain of fear. I know what happened on that afternoon, Cedric. Tall Crawl is not real, Cedric. It would feast on my undying loyalty. There are too many rules to count, Kai. The bounded man, Gidley explained, rocking aggressively on the bed like a hard-shelled egg ready to hatch. Your fault for denying him, I thought. My baby Isabel, and he did. Not rules imposed by an oddballed employer. Not rules penciled in on a scrap of paper. Less intimidating than it had been in the hospital room. Pull yourself together, Kai. He crawled up my body, you see. I looked down at the 11 deep cuts on my arm, forged by unclean fingernails, and then I looked at the 5 rules that I had sloppily jotted on my palm the night before. It wasn't even about Cedric's murderous rampage. It came through the window. For, I was simply amazed that she had made it through as many days as she did. I love you, she had promised me only an hour before she had ended it all. Martin. Pendleton. I thought there might be a way to go back, unbind myself from the Tall Crawl. Some oddities are fun, like 4 buses arriving at once. 5. I really wanted to bleed those warm fuzzy fibs as I pulled into my driveway. The ink on my palm had smudged from sweat and I didn't need the rules and writing any longer. I didn't want Mr. Hill tell you what to do, Kai, Cedric said. He always tells. Yes, we must always have honesty, must we not, Kai? Something stirred violently in my belly as Cedric uttered a nickname that I had only ever been messaged 3ed by my mother. But it's real, Kai. I wanted to remove any reasonable doubt. Lighten my own tone. He dressed it up as a vanilla sundae and I swallowed it with ease. Why did I entertain him? Well, I always entertain him. I had to interview this man. Walk no fewer than 11 steps per hour. He messaged 3 Tall Crawl. Andreas and Holly. That's the only reason I'm allowing this interview. But shout if you need me, I'll be right outside, Mr. I searched for the plug in the extension sockets. And at the foot of the trunk lay the unconscious bodies of the 2 people who meant the most to me. Andreas and Tali. She was stillborn, but she came back to life because I did his Tall Crawl at last. No, Pendleton replied. Something that I didn't see. What happened to her? I soundlessly asked. This story means a lot to me. Something stopped right before the glass pane. We talked about the price of breaking his rules. What is happening to me? I silently croaked, looking back at my reflection to find that it had returned to normal. My brother smiled and then returned to a solemn expression. Cedric Roberts said that something else had killed his family, said that a higher power was punishing him for getting a compulsion wrong, Kai. I paused, absorbing the world beyond my windscreen on the way home from the hospital. Driving on the other lane, seeing the countryside in reverse, the road seemed to have a freshly tarmac personality. It was about the itch on my nape. Humor me, Cedric, I thought. Martin, you're taking advantage of my grief by poking your nose into this. I'm not trying to take advantage of you. I lost any remaining free will, and by the time that I had accepted that, I had already lunged down, already plunged the steel knife into Andreas' chest. Plunged again and again and again. I always support his crackpot ideas. She laughed. In the name of a scintillating story, I had faced war criminals, traffickers, and next-door killers. The crawl was tangible, though it wore different skins. Old and withered skin, perhaps, but skin. Tall crawl stops the bad things, Kai. You just have to do what he says. Okay, Andreas. For when I had taken one step forwards defying its law, I took 2 steps backwards. He finally said, if you really have no exploitative intentions. Hey guy, Holly said, pulling me out of the trance. I'm just tired. Yeah, after you hung up, I realized that I should have reminded you. However, that pull remained, that urge to do its bidding. He crawls along the wall. Mr. I had forgotten that my younger brother and my housemate had invited a dozen of our closest friends over for a summer barbecue. Strangely, however, I found that I didn't mind. I feared that it might be linked in the worst way. When I disobey, I weaken it, I realized. Temporarily avoided me the illusion that the demon had given me back my freedom for a second, temporarily avoided me the illusion of independent will. It was a cruel joke that seemed to please Cedric Roberts, made him guffaw wildly as I tentatively pressed towards the exit. It was a clearer warning than any that I had ever seen, heard, or felt. My mind was telling me to turn back. I thank him every day. I had failed to complete a ritual much like Cedric, and a bad thing was coming. I imagine it'll help your career, the Dr. Cine message 3Y said. Kai Martin, the Kai Martin, he mocked. I wanted to disprove his claims of supernaturalism and grandeur. Impossible half-moon wounds inflicted by unseen puppet strings. It'll be linked below in the description. There buzzed a soft, cooling frequency in my brain. Well, no, he didn't threaten me. I screamed as my limbs started to snap into jagged angular formations. That shape returned with a barely human form, and it crawled towards the edge of the bed, crawled towards an escape, crawled towards me. Screaming with a voice box that finally worked, I scurried out of the door and down the corridor. I'd been a psychiatrist for less than 5 days, doctor without even arranging an appointment. I slumped into my car and set off. It was about more than our connection to the case. A terror that I desperately wanted to explain. Cedric would give me answers, but not the ones that I wanted. There was no illness. I sobbed as I lay atop him, sobbed as I felt the tree shift and creak above us. This was already a lot for me. You've lost the plot, I thought, clammy hands gripping the steering wheel. But it's only fair to do as he says. Time to figure out whether there might be a rational explanation for what had happened in room 307, an explanation other than it being a supernatural force with mysterious wants and not mysterious. I thought it feeds on attention and control, its sustenance came from obedience, from asinine rituals. 1. You were always supposed to come here, to welcome the tall crawl into your heart. I rummaged around behind the stand, guided only by moonlight and street lamps pouring through the lounge's windows. Kai? Holly asked. And punish any mistake, I thought, going over the rules in my head. Well, did you hear about Cedric Roberts? My brother had asked. Go and support the author and check out his YouTube channel, Black Volumes. It didn't reveal anything that the human gaze knew how to decipher, but there was something in the blackness. There's a genetic link with that illness after all, I reminded myself. But Cedric had been clear, very clear. As I raised the knife preparing to lunge, I started to wrestle with the urge of the crawl. That month's YouTube ad revenue was equal to a year's worth of earnings from the daily shitstain. No sound escaped. Andreas and I had lost our mother to suicide 7 years earlier. Titanic, writhing microbes, living around living things that fell into my wide, soundless maw. When I looked back up at the mirror, jaw hanging limply, my reflection had changed again. No artificial light between 1 and 6 in the morning. I turned off every last light in the house. Snapped it shut, and the tall crawl gave me Isabel. Footsteps sounding in horrible harmony with each stride as Cedric's leg fingers took across his flesh. I was so distracted by the approaching footsteps that in my state of terror, I barely noticed the pain. Don't walk in the shade of a backwards tree. Something that didn't belong. No artificial light between 1 and 6 in the morning. The 11 curved wounds. I had never seen her so fragile. Oh come on, I thought, is that what I missed? I realized that it had to be. Roberts continued, rocking on the bed as I failed to scream for Doctor, this is the place. It didn't look back at all, for there was no face left. Holly sighed. She was a detective after all, and she had clearly detected something in my voice during the message 3 giving her incessant questioning. It was even harder to shrug her off on the flash. I tugged at the sleeve of my jacket, hoping the wounds on my arm were concealed. That was a conversation that I didn't want to have, much like the Cedric-themed one that I knew was coming. Did he threaten you? Holly asked. That I didn't want to have, much like the Cedric-themed one that I knew was coming. I've interviewed worse people than Cedric Roberts. People only just got here though, so don't worry. I silently choked in horror, haunted by his choice of words. Honestly? Cedric repeated disbelievingly. But Andreas always found a way. Not quite a hit of dopamine, more so the release of tension. I did, but I wasn't going to tell Holly that, just as I wasn't going to tell her about the wounds on my arm. She was my friend, more than a friend, but she was also a law enforcer, one who was never really off duty, no matter how much she claimed otherwise. It longs for us to fumble so that it might exact its devious design. The man responded nonsensy message 3Y before offering a large smile. May I have an autograph? I sat on a chair opposite the bed. The man continued, avoiding all questions. I am the sickly bark of the tree. Fluttered on little legs, smiling. It's not that. My mother was an OCD sufferer, I replied, teeing up for the winning stroke. It took me fewer than 10 seconds to process what was wrong. Yes, officer. She nodded as if to say that she had already known. Bye-bye, Kai, the patient said, and then the man began to walk his fingers across his flesh once more. Less than 5 yards away. I was talking to our source at the station and she. Does it need me? Besides, I knew that I would see Holly soon enough and she would wrench the cat out of the bag, no matter how hard I tried to keep it hidden. I just needed time before that inevitable confrontation. I knew full well that I had heard numerous horror stories from killers over the years, heard of the awful things they had done to other humans. He was a strange sight. I let my hand lie still, stopped searching in the heap of technology for the extension sockets, and then I screamed. I had felt triumphant upon seeing Rod setting into the bark of the tree, but I was shriveling as painfully as the crawl. It's a horrible story, but I have nothing to add that wasn't already covered by the paper, I said. My brother smiled. I was certain of it, but the rule was vague, of course, intentionally so. Tall crawl gives no clarity. The wounds had been inflicted by the air itself, by invisible strings that the patient skillfully twirled in trained fingers. Andreas and Ollie. 5. A pale brown trunk with an unnervingly flat texture, as if it were skin, not bark. It was not a man, it was not any one thing at all. He looks like so many things. And for the first time ever, I let go of the anger, the blame. 2 rules defied in one fell swoop. Tall crawl, I softly said, sparking a sharp chill on my left forearm. It was only a child's bemusing name, as bemusing as my feeling of being watched by unseen things and not quite eyes, but some perplexing anomalies are borderline inexplicable. He's been docile today. But it was all over in seconds. And I remessaged 3 Ed how fragile and vulnerable the tall crawl had seemed as a resting pile of black cables. Do you want to be safe, Kai? So no one ever gets hurt like your mother again. Doctor, there lay a blade on the paved porch and I bent forward to scoop it up without a moment's hesitation, and then I strolled across the grass toward my 2 loved ones. They lay in fetal bundles like the cluster of living room cables neatly placed in the well-lit grass beside the ash tree's shadow. She eventually took her own life. There came a dull ache from spectral fingers too long to belong to Cedric rummaging in my skull. I fearfully surveyed my paralyzed self in the anti-ligature mirror on the wall behind the perturbing patient. I fully succumbed to the will of the crawl. I murdered him. It clung to Cedric like a heavy fabric. The tall crawl, that was what I saw. I try to remind myself of what I saw, that the tall crawl is not an impervious, omnipotent being, and it certainly does not prevent bad things from happening. It causes them. Fine, Doctor, I sighed, scrolling through my YouTube channel's analytics. The man replied, approving that he had reached into my mind. Right, didn't see that. Cedric's murderous confession was ghastly, but not the ghastliest. What made him so frightening was the intention behind his actions, the act of serving something beyond the earthly realm that was certainly new. I found that I actually wanted to be psychology message 3Y unwell, and that would have been an easier pill to swallow. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is treatable. I didn't know whether the curse had a cure. Pendleton asked, gasping as he rose to his feet. I didn't do it, I promised, watery eyes begging her to believe me. Really wanted to sleep most of all after a half-hour drive that felt eternal. I imagined myself waking up without a single memory of that awful visit to the psych ward, perhaps waking up without any memory of the Cedric Roberts case. Not its real name, believe it or not. Right, well, Holly revealed something interesting. 6, 7, 8, 9. Pendleton thought it best to have members of staff fizzy message 3Y restrain the man before I entered his room. What makes you think that? I replied. 3, I would like to speak to her then. I just forgot about tonight, that's all. No, it's not that. There came a long pause as the doctor cautiously chose his next words. I don't know what you saw in that room, but it wasn't real. But you'll run out of skin eventually. Pendleton. Holly, I gently began. Right. Did he kill her? I near silently asked Dr. Pendleton shook his head and then winced as if coming to his senses. I'm not myself at the moment. I really shouldn't be talking to a journalist about any of this. Rosetta was a dear friend of mine, Mister. It wasn't silly, I knew that. It didn't feel sufficient to turn off the switch. What have you done? I wailed, but my lips only formed the shapes of the words. Martin, Doctor, I was supposed to choose, but the options had been stripped from me. And as he did, there came the sound of slow, clacking footsteps in the hospital hall. To disobey came with hauntingly real outcome. 3's unlike my mother's illness. I had willingly defied a rule, willingly gone against the bidding of the crawl. I interrupted, feeling nauseated. I didn't need clarity much as I hadn't needed clarity with the list of rules. I knew that a punishment awaited. I'm following his creed, Kai. Walk no fewer than 11 steps per hour, the man sat, reciting his second rule. Tall crawl starts at your toes, you see, Cedric finally explained. He climbs up, and up. I massaged my arm and scooted backwards across the carpet in fear. It felt different than before, felt backwards in more than a literal sense. I silently pleaded for him to stop. For, he just talked a lot, in great detail. Holly nodded, but the frown persisted. That wasn't real, I lied to myself. And not just that, you're absolutely smitten with her. He claimed to perform rituals which really did stop bad things from happening. Crawling across my chin were not fingers, but black, oval pellets. Mister, the train pancaked the car end. It neared the living room window below which I was slouching against the wall, each crunch far louder than the last. And then these steps stopped. The fifth roll, Kai. Two colorless, spindly hands sprouted from behind my head like weeds, belonging to a figure hidden behind me, one that I am glad I didn't see, though I doubt it had a form to be seen. It's why I wasn't frightened of Cedric Roberts. "I'll let you conduct your interview privately," the doctor said as we stood outside of Cedric's room. Cedric exhaled as if the words were cathartic. I felt it. A 40-something-year-old, sitting like a monk or a well-behaved school child. He braked at the town's train crossing, stepped out of the vehicle and locked the doors. "It speaks in riddles, deceives. Martin." She was Cedric's specialist for 11 months. "Kai." She pressed. "Please tell me what you and Cedric discussed, though I don't have to worry about losing my job. When you do what he says, he crawls, grows, feeds until he's tall. Everything started 3 months ago." The patient, surprisingly, was keen on the idea of talking to a journalist. As I moved towards the window, the outside light started to reveal the new marks on my arms. A force that hungered for nothing but my servitude. Both of my loved ones would perish in my hand, though I had no say in the matter. They should be kept safe. I eyed the ash tree's shadow which was cast to the side of my two friends, and then I smiled, seeing what I believed to be a way forward before taking a well-meaning stride into the shade. Dread knifed my heart and a boiling liquid flooded my skull, enveloping me in fear beyond fear. Do whatever he bids and do it twice if you doubt yourself. 2. Because she would rather not speak to a journalist. I whispered to Holly as the sun dawned. It isn't something that words fit around. She shook her head and held me in her arms. I said nothing. As I passed countless grand oaks lining the never-ending lane, I thought of Cedric's curse. The 5 rules that he had bestowed upon me, plus any others the tall crawl might add. The cables released me. I nodded. My autonomy had been stripped by Cedric, and worst of all, he somehow heard or felt what I had silently screamed. Not real. Please, I silently begged. Her death was pretty real, I thought. A little after 1 in the morning, I woke up in a sweat. To starve it was only the beginning. Snap the bird when it sings. The man, if he were even a man anymore, simply grinned at me. I hear it in your voice. Are you still there? Yes, I answered weakly. But neither was the case. I should have been. Not meaningless fingernail prints as had been left by Cedric, but something of significance. As if in response, fresh lines formed in my flesh. You look a little pale. I smiled. As he did, the duvet started to lift. 3 stories of tall glass panes lined up far too squarely.